And Josh, I really like that. That was really nice. Thank you. Beautiful. Well, every 3 years I see our Old Testament lesson come up in the lectionary, which is a common system that churches use to work through the Bible in a 3-year cycle. And when I sat down to work on this sermon, I decided after much prayer and consideration that I should start by pointing out that this set of verses troubles me a lot. No one has to agree with me, but my trouble with them is they anchor in the father of our faith, Joseph, theological grounds to justify the evil act of selling and enslaving people as if they're part and parcel of God's purpose. To be blunt, at the end of Black History Month, the cutting from the lectionary suggests enslavement can be a part of God's plan. As we heard, Joseph says in the message, don't feel badly, don't blame yourselves for selling me. God was behind it. But throughout the Bible, we're told God's love is steadfast and it endures forever for everybody. Not only that, but the Bible also proclaims that God is love. And how could love ever plan to enslave an object of love, a human being? And the only answer I can come up with is love can't do that. We know deep in our hearts that a God who is love can't plan slavery. Love desires the well-being of others. And enslavement is not, and never has been, a form of well-being for any slave ever. And the Joseph story has more than just ugliness of slavery in it. Not all slavery in history was race-based like it was in America, but racism can be found raising its ugly head in the Joseph narratives too. A few chapters back, Genesis chapter 43 at verse 32, we're told Egyptians won't eat at the same table with Hebrews. It is repulsive to them. And one can't help but wonder if that is why a few generations after Joseph, the Hebrews end up being enslaved in Egypt, causing God, love, to cry out, let my people go. And I want to also add that it's not just racism and slavery issues in the Joseph narrative that are ugly. There's family dysfunction, lots of it. Jacob had 4 wives. 2 are his first cousins, the sisters Leah and Rachel. And Jacob barters for them. And the father sells them to him in exchange for work. And the other 2 wives are Bilhah and Zilpah, and they're gifted to Leah and Rachel as handmaiden slaves, and then gifted to Jacob as secondary wives to breed children for the family, since Leah and Rachel were having trouble doing that. And by the end of Genesis, Jacob has 13 children, 1 girl, and 12 boys from 4 wives. Jacob's second wife, Rachel, is, though, far and away Jacob's favorite wife, and he also heavily favors the children that he had with her, Joseph and Benjamin. And my hunch is it's not hard for any of us to figure out this family is a mess. And it's not likely a surprise bad behavior results. Well, the culture was very, very different back then. The jealousy, rivalry, and resentment that plays out in what we'd expect from the family dynamics, with 2 wives that are sisters, 2 wives that are slaves, and 1 wife, Rachel, being highly favored along with her 2 children. In other words, what plays out in this highly dysfunctional family story is not surprising. The dynamics and human reactions, even 3,500 years later in a different culture, predict the basic types of trouble that come with people vying for the affection and favor of a powerful patriarch. We can understand the resentment of Joseph's brother from the favoritism alone. But Joseph, as a kid, makes it worse. He claimed dreams he had meant he'd be above them all. And Jacob adds more fuel to the fire, giving Joseph a fabulous coat, the likes of which none of the other children get. Plus, Joseph appears to get out of labor the brothers of other mothers have to do. So it shouldn't be much of a surprise that Joseph's arrogance and Jacob's favoritism leads to jealousy, even lethal hatred. And sure enough, almost all the brothers conspire to kill him, but they change their mind and they sell him into slavery. And then they tear up Joseph's fabulous coat, and they soak it in goat blood, and they claim a wild beast killed Joseph. So no one goes looking for him. He's not rescued from slavery for years and years. Unfortunately, while enslaved, Joseph earns the respect of his male master. His female master, however, you may remember, admires him in another way, and when Joseph refuses to commit adultery, she drums up false charges of sexual assault, and she has him cruelly imprisoned for years. And this is all pretty rough stuff. And while the patriarchal ways of things hurt his family, the patriarch, Jacob, is hurt too. His family's a mess. He's tormented by the loss of a beloved son. And that favored son for many years got no favors. His own kin causes enslavement, which he endured for years before it got worse, and he was imprisoned. And it's at that low point that things start to change. In jail, Joseph helps a couple of inmates. He helps them understand their dreams. And years later, when Pharaoh has trouble interpreting dreams, he learns from one of the former inmates that a prisoner named Joseph might be able to help. And Joseph's summoned by Pharaoh and helps him. And Joseph's helping is tending to others' well-being, leads to his being helped out of prison and put in charge of storing up the food his interpretation of Pharaoh's dream suggested should be done. And his efforts work well and tend to the well-being of others, saving Egypt from far-reaching famine. And eventually, Pharaoh puts him in charge of all of Egypt, including handing out food to refugees that are coming in from other countries. When Joseph's dad sends his brothers to get help with food during the famine, they travel to Egypt, and they go before Joseph, and they ask for help. They don't recognize him. Joseph sure recognizes them, and he toys with them, sending them back with food, but also setting them up for accusations of crimes and threats of extremely severe punishments. And our lesson that Tony read so well describes how Joseph eventually stopped toying with his family and finally disclosed his identity to his brothers. And this put the fear of God into them. As we heard, they were so dismayed, they couldn't even talk. This very powerful man that they once tore away from the family and disposed of like trash by selling him into slavery. That man now holds the entire family's lives in his hands. He gets to decide whether to feed or not feed them in the famine. He gets to decide whether to get even and mete out justice through imprisonment, enslavement, or execution. Or he could decide to forgive and reunite, to love those who did him harm by providing for their well-being, regardless of their sins and evil acts that caused such great harm to him. The dysfunction in the family and the culture leads to this crossroad. Choices now need to be made. Which way should Joseph go? Should the brother who was sold into slavery for profit get even? Something very popular in our politics today. Or should the brother lovingly forgive the sinful and evil acts and tend to his brothers and the rest of his family's well-being? Which would the brothers want done to themselves? Which would God want him to do? And for Christians, we might also ask, what would Jesus do? And of course, what would we do? Or better yet, what should we do? What should Joseph do? And we heard what Joseph, after some hesitation, ultimately did. He said, hurry back to my father. Tell him your son Joseph says, I'm master of all Egypt. Come as fast as you can and join me here. I'll give you a place to live in Goshen where you'll be close to me, you, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and anything else you can think of. I'll take care of you there completely. There's still 5 more years of famine ahead. I'll make sure all your needs are taken care of, you and everyone connected with you. You won't want a thing. And in case any of us are wondering, that's not only what Joseph did, it's what God wanted Joseph to do. It is what God would want us to do. It was a similar situation. It's what Jesus later teaches his followers to do. And God is behind all that goodness. God is love. Love that pulls us to care and desire and to provide well-being to others. That's where God is at in this story. The story in the Bible puts words in Joseph's mouth suggesting the brothers who put him into slavery should not feel badly or blame themselves for selling him because God was behind it. That's wrong. It's terrible theology that does not match up with the God of steadfast and enduring love. That God, the God of love, the God of Joseph and Jesus, was behind making the best out of it all, working with him and within Joseph and others to extricate him and lead him to the top of the heap to help others. God wasn't behind any of the evil. Behind all the evil were bad choices by people. Jacob, Joseph, the brothers, the slave marketeers, the slave owners, the culture that allowed slavery, and the family's dysfunction. Giving those selling people into slavery and slavery itself a wink and a nod that it's not them, but God who's planned their evil acts sure seems to be the patriarchal elites trying to justify their terrible practice of inflicting slavery on non-elites, making the awfulness of the text's false theology come into high relief is that the lectionary brings it up during Black History Month. And you don't need a theology degree to know something's amiss when Scripture claims slavery's a part of God's plan. All you need to know is the Bible claims God is love and that God's love is steadfast and endures forever for everyone. Plus, we know in our own hearts, God wouldn't plan to have anyone enslaved, period. We would not make such a plan for anyone, let alone those we love. So we know God with so much more love could not cause the enslavement of anyone. Only evil behaving humans cause enslavement. Love cannot plan evil. And you think from all the confusion in our faith as to what love is or not love, that it can be difficult to tell what love is. But that's not true. Long ago, a simple test was set out by Jesus to show what love would do. It's a litmus test for love that works every time. And most religions have the test in one form or another. Jesus put along these lines: do to others what you want done to yourself. If you don't want it done to you, it's not love. If you would want to be free instead of enslaved, make sure no one is enslaved. That's love. If you wanted to be treated equally and with respect, regardless of your skin color, your gender, your sexuality, your nationality, religion, disability, or political views, then treat everyone equally and with respect. That's love. Doing otherwise is not only lack love, it is decidedly not Jesus' way. There's never been a sane person who has wanted slavery done to themselves. It's not an act of love. It's not tending to others' well-being, ever. Love can't plan evil. There's never been a sane person who wanted to be treated unequal and with disrespect because of skin color, gender, sexuality, nationality, religion, disability, or political views. Those are not acts of love. It's not tending to others' well-being, ever. Love can't plan and do evil. We all want to be forgiven. No doubt Joseph's brothers did. Joseph was right to forgive and love his family, including the brothers who treated him so awful. Those who helped Joseph along the way were right too. In New Testament, Jesus speaks, that's how we love our neighbors, and for that matter, our enemies. It's doing to others what we want done to ourselves. It's in the Old Testament too. Love your neighbor, Jesus got out of Torah. An Old Testament prophet Micah detailed what that sort of love looks like way back when, what God expects. Micah 6 instructs that God expects only 3 things of us: to seek justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. Helping Joseph people did those 3 things, and it mattered. Without justice, kindness, and humble walking with God, it's very unlikely Joseph would ever have risen to power and been able to save so many, including his family, and basically all of Israel, in the long run from famine. In the Joseph narrative, The evil ways of slavery and racism were overcome by God's good ways and others' good action. Which leads me to my next point. On this year of the 160th anniversary of the church, some of us are looking into the history of the church. And I have to tell you, this church has a long history of doing that kind of good work, seeking justice and loving kindness and walking humbly with God. And I decided I'd close the sermon with a few examples. Like how in 1880, after an anti-Chinese meeting, an infamous one, was held in the city of Stockton, City Hall, our church, just a few weeks later, became the very first Stockton church to intentionally welcome Chinese Americans as full members. And sadly, a few weeks later, the pastor, Reverend David Temple Packard, who welcomed them, was killed in a carriage accident. And nothing I found have hinted that his death was nefarious, but in a very anti-Chinese time, it certainly crossed my mind. And either way, I lift up Reverend Packard, our fifth minister, as a local hero, and a saint of this church. And his efforts seem to send us into new levels of justice and kindness and humble walks with God, because by the 1880s, we were not only working with the Chinese American communities, we also swapped pulpits and were working with the Jewish communities. And jumping ahead to the middle of the 20th century, historical records also evidence that in the 1940s, we openly opposed the unjust internment of Japanese Americans and stored the belongings of those forcibly taken to the terrible internment camps for Americans who were of Japanese descent. In the 1940s, we also led the way in forming the city's first interracial council, and the church continued to participate in the civil rights movement right up to the present. And in the 1970s, we became involved in justice for women and housed and supported the Stockton Women's Center. And our 21st century justice work has included declaring courageously that we are open and affirming, and right up to this very day being advocates and allies for LGBTQ plus people, for women, for African Americans, for people of color, for farm laborers, and for those experiencing housing and food insecurity. We've also been long involved in interfaith and ecumenical work for the betterment of the whole community. It's incredible. What a wonderful church. Well, why do we do this justice work? Because God calls us away from oppression and hate and toward seeking justice and loving kindness and walking humbly with God. And Joseph and those who helped him answered that call. And this church has clearly been striving to answer it for 160 years. And may First Congregational Church of Stockton be blessed to strive for it for another 160 years. Amen.